All right. Well, welcome back to Always on the Hunt. Today's guest has built a career at the center of one of the fastest growing segments in the AV industry, and that's DirectView LED. Jessica Sanders has worked across nearly every side of the business, from running her own company to roles in rep firms, distribution, and global manufacturers. Along the way, she's driven significant growth, scaling revenues from hundreds of thousands into tens of millions through channel and distribution strategies, both nationally and globally. But this conversation goes beyond career and market success. Jessica has also gone through a personal transition, and we're going to talk about that experience as well. What it was like, how the industry responded, and what professionals should understand and navigate about navigating these situations with respect and professionalism. We'll cover what it takes to win in direct LED, how to build strong channel partnerships, and how to grow in the industry, along with an honest conversation about identity, leadership, and the workplace. So, with all that being said, Jessica, welcome to Always on the Hunt.
Awesome, Leo. Thank you very much for that amazing introduction. Definitely a walk down memory lane, thinking about all these little turns I've had in my career from,
Yeah,
starting off as, a simple musician at a local church and then growing all the way to what I'm currently doing now with overseeing global distribution for a tech manufacturer. So,
great.
yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. I'm glad to be on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to have you on. I've kind of had like a little bit of a front row seat. You and I have known each other for a number of years now, and so I've got to see you go through a lot of these changes. Both professionally and personally, and that's why I'm excited to have you on the show, and hopefully educate the industry more about you, your career, and everything else that we're going to discuss. So let's start from the beginning. You mentioned that you're working at a church. So how did you get into the AV industry?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So this is way back when, like pre, turn of the century, as I call it, like 1998, whatever. And like I had always been very musically inclined. I went to college on scholarship to play electric bass. And so like audio and music performance have gone hand in hand for me.
Hmm.
One quick funny story, I ran sound for my local church, not a big church at that time, but we had this, old console and everything was wired for the direct outs into post fader. So if you move the fader, it would change the level that that direct out would be sending out to the for signal. And so we wanted to go to this brand new like, audio system that allowed us to use in-ears and things like that. And the only thing I could figure out how to do was to go inside the console and actually unsolder the connection and resolder it, one little spot down from jumper one to jumper two.
Hmm.
And I talked everyone into letting me do that, and it worked fine. And that's when I kind of got hooked on audio. I loved understanding circuitry and how system design and flow, and then integrating, at my local church, and then going to college and studying more audio and music performance, and then touring, and then kind of getting really my chops into, meeting up with a friend of mine, way back when, like 2008, 2006, we started our own little small company and we were
Hmm.
doing integration into house of worship and, projection design. And then, all this, great things that Pro AV at that time could offer. We were offering it to other houses of worship. And so I got really involved doing audio for a variety of churches, ran for quite a few different venues and rooms, some seats up to like 4,000, and
Wow.
would run, production. And I loved it. I was absolutely hooked. And I knew I wanted to spend my career doing that. And so there was a time where I was looking to, move down to Texas. And so I did what I wanted to do. I was kind of freelancing at the time for a big production company, but I wanted to do something more on my own as well. And so I started, doing integration more globally, not globally, but nationally, picking up different clients and mixing audio and playing bass and all this fun stuff that was just in the industry. But, I was like, I want to go work for a manufacturer. So I kind of figured out I should probably go work for a manufacturer's rep firm to get some
Okay.
credibility. And so I then, I emailed every manufacturer's rep that I could find in Texas. And so I was like, "Hey, I'm looking to move down to San Antonio or San Antone. I would love if there was an opportunity for us to work together." I explained who I was, things like that. I got one email back. And so I went with it. I was like, yeah, I want to do that. So I ran South Texas for a manufacturer's rep firm. I loved it. It taught me so much, from, how do I run a territory? How do I interact with dealers? How do I face problems?
Sure.
And, how do we build customer success from that way? And then just kind of growing and expanding from there. I got to be able to consult with a few LED manufacturers, right after I left that. And I was doing some national sales with them and just
Hmm.
trying to figure out my place where it was like, oh, this is what I want to do more. I want to actually work for a manufacturer. I want to, grow and scale my career from that point. So I did that. Like
Right.
you said, worked for a distributor, then ran distribution for a major LED manufacturer, and now currently, doing some global work for a company that's in our space. And it's all I've known the last 15 years. So when I say I'm a lifer, I'm absolutely a pro AV lifer from that standpoint.
Absolutely. So it's amazing how many people get into our industry through the musician side, right? And so you mentioned that you got in and you loved audio, but here you are being a video expert. How'd you make that leap?
Yeah, I always tell people jokingly, like, listen, audio is always fun, but if you want to get paid, go work in
Right.
video.
Right.
And it was kind of like, when I was freelancing, I could do web stream, I could do playback, I could do all these different positions where audio, there's like only like four or five different, guys
Right.
running the whole show, where Video Village has got probably a dozen or so. And so I could always kind of find gigs that way. And then I feel like I have a really good, eye for color and things like that. So I've been able to really kind of understand, dot pitch and the nuance there and refresh and all the technical terms that we will try to stay away from on
R-
this conversation. But,
Yeah.
I fell in love. I fell in love with it. It was something that I absolutely enjoyed. And I was like, I love LED. So I was like, yeah, let's do this. So that's
Right.
kind of where I've hung my hat over the last, 12 years or so.
Yeah. Look, LED's one of the fastest growing segments of our space, right? Like I also, got into this industry because I love the control side of things. And here I am, when you look at a lot of my clients, they're in the LED space. So you mentioned that you worked, you had your own business and worked for rep firms, distribution manufacturers, like as you were navigating your career and making these moves, like what do you think were some of the key moves that really shaped your career, or what were you kind of thinking as you were making these jumps?
It's like, how do I build experience? And wanting to get to that higher level, in sales management, sales leadership. What would I be looking for from a person that I was looking to bring on? And what's a unique advantage that they have? And I felt from my standpoint, it was always cultivating. Listen, I've been there from a dealer, from an integrator, integrating product, a small, few person shop
Hmm.
to where I've laid in scissor lifts, installing cables at 2 o'clock in the morning, like so many of us have done before, to actually balancing the books and figuring out how do we make money, what do we do, how do we grow, how do we expand. And so being able to say, listen, I've been in every one of those positions and sat in every one of those chairs, I feel like has given me a complete viewpoint of what's needed in the industry, and it's served me so well because I know what it's like to be able, or installing a solution or whatever, and it's not what you're being told it is.
Right.
And so being able to make sure, hey, we are going to make sure we do best by our customers, providing support and feedback, making sure our customer service is always the best it possibly can be. That's always been something that I've always kind of focused my career on, is making sure I take care of my people and my customers. You always look at winning in three different areas: the people, the product, and then the process. If we have
Right.
good, strong processes, be able to grow and expand, we can take care of the business, which allows us to take care of our people. And we know if our people are always in, a good space, they're happy, this is the place that they feel like they can thrive and grow, then we know that by having those people, they're going to push our product and it's
Right.
going to make us successful because we're going to constantly balance all three of those. I was talking to a mentor of mine a few months ago, and he asked me, what do you need to be able to grow, an LED business? And he's like, is it sales? Is it marketing? I was like, it's
Right.
everything at all time hitting at 100% or as close to possible to it. Um, so you
Yeah.
have to take care of everything. One of my favorite quotes ever, or favorite little stories, is about Truett Cathy and Chick-fil-A, and they're figuring out how do they outmaneuver competition. The chicken restaurants were starting to become really popular,
Hmm.
and they're seeing a lot of competition at this time, and so they're like, hey, they're brainstorming in the boardroom. They're like, do we take on debt to be able to expand and grow? Do we do this, do we do that? And then Truett Cathy, who's at a ripe old age at this time, pounds his fist on the table as the story goes. And he says, no, if we focus on getting better, we'll get bigger. And so that's always been my mindset. How do we get better as an organization,
Right.
and everything 360 around us to be able to grow? So that's been always my mindset and what's kind of
Yeah.
set me up and catapult me for success over the last several years.
You know, y-
We look at
eh,
a Go ahead.
I was just going to jump in, and kind of say, like, look, as I mentioned, I've kind of had a front row seat to your career. I've seen it grow, and one thing that's consistent is you've always driven growth, right? Like, you got into that direct LED space, and you just took off with it, and so you mentioned the people, the products, but when you were being an individual contributor, right, and had that, not really in a position to impact a lot of change at a corporate level, what were you doing as an individual to kind of fuel that growth, push that growth, and really, um, you know, push your career forward?
Yeah, from an individual contributor standpoint, I was always willing to give feedback to my leadership team and like say, hey, this is what I'm seeing in the market. And looking back now, it's like that was extremely important, but always doing what I say I'm going to do, always communicating effectively, always making sure that, if I take on a project or a task, we're going to do it. We're going to keep everyone informed and we're going to just go at it that point.
Hmm.
But it just comes down to building relationships. We may think that we're selling, you know, pro AV products, but we're building relationships more than
Right.
anything else. And so every relationship that I built, like I would always, value that and hold on to it. And like there's still people I talk to, from 15 years ago that I first cut my teeth with in this industry. And like even reaching out today to, friends that are, accepting new roles and new positions and growing their careers,
Hmm.
like, hey, I will always be there for you. Please reach out, because like a good friend of mine says, the badge on the shirt may change, but we all work
Right.
and still see each other at the same trade shows
Yeah.
and different events. But it's always just honestly showing up every day, doing what you say you're going to do, and then just driving growth that way. Like if
Right.
you take care of the basics, it puts you in a spotlight. If you
Yeah.
communicate, do all the things I mentioned earlier, and then it allows you to kind of say, okay, this is my time in waiting or my time in the wings, if you will. I'm just going to sit here. I'm going to do my job. I'm going to continue to grow, study, educate, and then there'll be the right time.
Sure.
Opportunities will present itself. I always laugh at the harder you work, the luckier you get,
Always. Always.
and it's like the same case with like personal growth and strategy. The harder you work, the higher you perform, the more awards you win,
Yeah.
more you are of a
Yeah.
go getter, people notice and it matters. So I would definitely be that person if I was sitting in an individual contribution type role or contributor role. Just do your job, do it to the best of your ability, constantly, ask for feedback. Don't, one of my big pet peeves is don't present a problem without finding a solution by yourself.
Yeah. Which is
Independently
perfect.
figuring out what you got to do is like, hey, this is the problem we're facing. This is what I think. It may not be the right solution per year, but this is my recommendation right now,
Right.
and then just
With
being that valuable contributor at that point.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you because you mentioned like one of the things that one of the first things you said when I asked you, like, what did you do on an individual contributor level? You were like, I gave my management a lot of feedback, which a lot of people, could be afraid to do, or maybe they don't do it properly. But, you just touched upon, like, just don't, it's not just about complaining. It's also about providing solutions, or giving positive feedback, or
Yeah.
more solution driven. Um, you also mentioned just doing the basics, which is always so surprising to me, right? It's like um, so many things that high performers take for granted, right? And like, we don't realize that there's a lot of people that just won't do the basics, right?
Yeah.
They, right? It's absolutely crazy to me. Um, as you were going through all these different steps in your career. Um, you obviously got to see what some companies do well, what some, and I don't want you to name names, or, we're not going to put anyone on blast or anything, right? So,
This
uh,
isn't that podcast. Maybe
no,
maybe there's another one down the road. No, I'm
yeah,
joking.
right. No, no, no. We'll keep it positive. But, like, what did you see that certain companies just do better than others, and where others fail? Like what do you constantly, I see it a lot, right? As a recruiter, I could see how bad companies are at hiring, at onboarding, at training, at career path. Like I could go on and on about what people do wrong from my vantage point. What have you seen, like, in the market, or with some of your previous employers, where people are like, hey, this seems to be a repetitive um, mistake that this industry makes?
Yeah. Especially in LED and my side of the ball that I've been playing on the last, 10, 15 years, we look at everything extremely siloed. And a lot of times, like you feel like you're just in this position and that's all you're doing. There's not a lot of that team mindset in some of these bigger organizations where, we're trying to grow and cultivate and developing, vision and mindset and getting everyone on the same page. It feels like you can just be stuck kind of on your personal island doing that job. And one of the things that I've always tried to focus on, with any corporation I is to set that tonality when it comes to what this is going to be like, the atmosphere of the place we're working at, or what's the community feeling going to be like, and making sure that, hey, one of the biggest things I was seeing at some of these bigger companies is just be the gossip mill. And, there'll
Hmm.
be a lot of things I just like, no, this is toxic. We're not going to
Right.
do this. If we have any issues, we're going to go to that person directly and we're going to have conversations with them. But, a lot of these companies, it just feels like your job is to put, a widget into the box and you're done. It's like, no, I can't operate like that. That's not my
Yeah.
my mindset. It's like, how do we get a better understanding of what's going on so people feel like they legitimately have buy-in to the process?
Right.
And it's when you create that buy-in, you actually build a team. And yeah, you may still just be putting a widget in a box, but you feel like you're a part of something bigger and you're actually
Hmm.
creating something that's special to the market. So,
Right.
creating and cultivating teams is something I've seen a lot of our LED companies not do well. And it's something I've
Yeah.
always pushed, creating that communication cycle to where we're setting a singular tone and vision for what we're trying to accomplish, and it's clear.
Right.
We got to have vision that's understandable, that's be able to break down and say, okay, these are our objectives. This is how we're going to measure it. This is how we're going to show what that success looks like, and then following up. But at the same time, not being afraid to make adjustments when needed. I think a
Hmm.
lot of times our companies get really married to the process and they forget about understanding that, hey, we don't live in that process vacuum, if you will. We're trying to really understand how this actually is going to fit into a market and how it's going to be able to be adapted to what we're trying to do for, our
Right.
customers. And so being able to take that feedback back and forth and understanding, okay, things are probably going to look different than when we originally started out to be able to to hit our target, to hit our goal. Adapt or die has always been or something that's been on my mindset. You
Sure.
got to be able to make changes to be able to grow and be
Yeah.
successful. So,
Yeah. And there's always that question as far as when when do you still like stay the course, right? Before you adapt too quickly versus when you realize like, hey, it's time to pivot and we need to make some changes. What what do you look for to know when it's that time?
yeah, so I always would set people that I absolutely trust. Whether for me it was distributors that I was, working with on a day in, day out basis,
Mhm.
getting feedback from them, getting feedback from their sales reps, from their dealers, etc. When I would hear things a few different times from a few independent sources that I know aren't just talking to the same people and someone was just
Sure.
trying to get their point out and really understand like no, this is independent information that's arriving to me and it's practically, pretty close to the same. That's when I would start to consider, is there something that we need to change?
Yeah.
And figure out what my options were because the one thing you don't want to do is pivot away from something that's working say at 80% to
Mhm.
just change something that's working at 60%.
Right.
That's going to reduce things. So you need to understand exactly what the problem is, how we can adjust, how we can fix it, how is going to create space for us in the market by doing it, and then how does this catapult us to you know proverbially win more.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I look at that.
And you mentioned that, obviously feedback from the clients and your trusted, partners. Do do you have like your own personal like, you mentioned earlier you were talking to a mentor. Like do you have like a
Yeah.
personal advisory board like that, a handful of people you call and
Yes,
pick.
we actually got shirts and no, I'm joking. No, there's probably about 6 people that I speak to on a semi-regular basis
Yeah.
that, we have conversation about the market and we get feedback, but like it's really important for me to have that mentorship from those type of individuals and advancing where I'm at in my career, it's been really nice to be able to now do that for others.
Right.
And,
Right.
it's that law of teaching, if you will. A 2 is never going to be able to teach a 4, how to do something, but a 4 can teach a 2 how to do things, pretty well. And so where I'm at, like I'm always looking for people that are hungry and that want to
Mhm.
grow and kind of honestly exhibit some of the same things that I did in my career and just wanted to, want to make a noise, want to be, visible in the industry and really try to be able to just make a name for this. And then conversations that happen and evolve. And it's not like there's a stamp that goes out
Right.
where we're now in this type of, mentor mentoree type relationship, but it just happens naturally.
Right.
I don't think any of my guys I've really besides one have asked like I need you as a mentor. It just kind of happened and evolved over time and feedback would come both ways and things like that and it's just been really really good, but I don't want to open that up too big in my life because I want to be able to hone on people that I can trust.
Right.
I don't believe in taking advice just from every single person that's out there. If that was the case, then there would be some crazy, rabbit holes
Yeah.
I'd be in with my
It,
career or whatever.
right.
It's like you got to be able
It
to focus that. Yeah.
right. Right. It doesn't become advice anymore. It just becomes a bunch of opinions, right? So
Oh, absolutely.
but you mentioned something in which I liked was like um, that you look for people that that do the similar things that you do, but you said something about like making noise right in this industry. Um, when you look back in your career, how did you make noise, give an example of when you made some noise?
Yeah, from a product standpoint or things like that, we would always I always believed in figuring out and never talking bad about competition, never would once would ever do that, but I would figure out like little pain points that each one of my competitors were having. And I
Hmm.
would sit there and I would make sure that we had a way around that and we were able to outmaneuver that standpoint and we'd figure out different ways to be able to go after, honestly different clients, things like that, customers, and be able to offer a solution based on that pain point. And so that created a lot of noise when it came into the into the channel and what we are doing for Pro AV sales, because we were winning very, very, very handily at the companies I was working for. Um, but I always look for people, I always try to be active on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is where we all, it's our
Right.
it's our it's our happy hour almost for Pro AV at
Sure.
some times where we all just want to hang out and talk. And you know I always laugh at the posts that say, this is not LinkedIn appropriate. And I've had a few of those, not gonna
Sure.
lie.
Sure.
Um, and a few of them have like been some of my biggest, like threads or whatever, interactions and whatnot. But it's like, hey, you know what? We got to enjoy this life. We can poke fun at ourselves a little bit.
Yeah.
But I always look for people that just want to stand out and they're willing to work hard, and it looks different from every person. I got, you know, pictures of people that I'm thinking of right now in my brain. It's like, oh wow, they're completely different to say than this person or that person,
Yeah. They
but
stand out.
they're setting their own course. They're setting out, and the cream will always rise to the top, like we were kind of talking about earlier. And they'll find a way to kind of get noticed. And there's quite a
Right.
few of the younger generation. I say that being 42, but those that are in their 30s or the late 20s who are doing that, and it's
Yeah.
quite noticeable and exciting to see their careers develop. And like you alluded to earlier, we've known each other for quite a while, got to see each other's careers and things like that. And, I would always like, hey, what do I need to do? How do I pivot? How do I do this? Like, give me feedback on certain things. And it's like, well, you need to change this, you need to change that. I'm like, done, and I would
Right.
figure out a way to be able to implement that and listen and understand what those who have more experience see or say that's needed for you to be successful in the market.
Yeah.
So
And look, I think a couple of things that I pulled out of this segment is that, one, go, don't think you have to know it all. There are mentors out there. They're accessible. You build those relationships, and people sometimes are just afraid, ego or whatever, or they're afraid to reach out for help. It's amazing how much our industry, you know, it's a lot of tribal knowledge, right? Like there aren't like courses in universities, so like you have to learn from your elders, and then you pass it back down, to the next generation. People are willing to do it. But I love the idea of like making noise, because you got to stand out. You got to be unique. You got to be different. You got to do things a little bit differently, and not be. There's too many people that try to just blend in, right? And
right.
it's funny how the noisemakers are the ones that actually advance. You mentioned that you guys were doing things a little bit differently. I think one of the things that you did probably better than anyone else is sell DirectView LED through distribution, which was a product that many thought couldn't be sold through distribution. Not that I want you to give away your secrets or anything, but talk about that. Talk about your successes, and what you've been able to do that few
Yeah.
others have.
So I remember in past roles, like having to take that elementary standpoint of like going to the warehouse and understanding how this gets pulled and packed and what pain points we're facing.
Hmm.
From back in the day, all in ones, which show up in these big wooden cases, and there'd be like three of them for like a 136-inch or a 165. And it just was mammoth. And it took out all this warehousing space, and a distributor's trying to maximize their basically profit per square foot they're at the warehouse. And if they're having to take up space with all these different things, then it's not distribution friendly. So being able to create, what we call ATA cases that could fit through the single door, and, understanding kind of what was needed from a dealer perspective with that, and like making it channel ready. And then
Hmm.
honestly, understanding batching in LED and how do we forecast sales and how do we set, what we recommend for our distributors to buy, and then creating programs that allowed them to be successful when there was remaining products in the batch. So being able to, if like, hey, if we get down to X amount of product left, we're going to buy it back. we're going to, we'll keep it off
Hmm.
that way, reduces aged inventory, gets it off your books, and building programs like that into your overall scope so that you do become extremely distribution friendly and that your distributors like, hey, we know if we're bringing this in, not, not just a, aged inventory clause or something like that, but hey, that this company is going to make sure that we're not just sitting on 3 or 4 little panels for a year and a half, 2 years.
Sure.
We're gonna do things right and just build programs. Like, I had no idea what I was doing, honestly, and, when it came to warehousing or, when it came to and I knew about batches, obviously, working at LED, but, like, how do we actually distribute batch products until I sat down and I listened to everyone in that chain. From spending time, at the factory, like I mentioned earlier, with not at the factory, but
The
at the
warehouse.
distributor
Yeah.
and the warehouse, and understanding from their perspective the pain points and what needs to change with our boxing and things like that, all the way to the VP and
Right.
understanding what his pain points and issues were, and then coming up with a plan, and then honestly, even speaking to our factory, I'm like, "Hey, this has gotta be different. We need to incorporate, barcodes and UPCs and things like that," which were, honestly kinda unheard of a few years ago. It just
Hmm.
wasn't done in LEDs. So by just being able to adapt and being
Sure.
that company that our distributors were like, "Hey, we want to do work, or we want to do business with that company because they're going to pay attention and they're going to let us know, that they can adapt to what our needs are." And I think
Yeah.
that's probably one of the best thing. Like when you're having a conversation with someone, you can always tell when someone's not really listening. And it's
Hmm.
like, why am I going to interact with this person? I don't feel like I can ever get, 2 words in edgewise or whatever. It's the same way in relationships with clients. It's just not you going out there and spewing all your
Sure.
rhetoric and your sales pitch. It's actually being able to just like, okay, we want to incorporate this. We like this. And honestly, being able to say sometimes, no, we can't do it that way. And then coming up with alternate solutions. It's
Yeah.
not always perfect by any stretch.
Right.
So it's the
So
biggest part that we look at.
so it sounds, to me, it sounds like you learn from every aspect of your career, from being a rep and, working with dealers, being a dealer yourself, working with dealers, selling different products, understanding distribution, and then what you didn't know, you went further and went and listened. I always it's that old adage, two ears, one mouth type of thing, right? You got to listen more than you talk when you sell. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, it's the basics. It's so funny. It's like what's the secret of your success? The basics, right?
Well, yeah, and I
Simplifying.
know I
Yeah.
know if I have my basics down, then I can incorporate and I have good data, which is always what I'm trying to get down to. And this just
Hmm.
kind of gets to my nerdy wheelhouse. Is like I can incorporate that data into different tools that I have, whether it's, it's AI or it's a good CRM that's incorporating different, type of, analysis tools, things like that. And I can understand where market's going, how things are changing, how we need to adapt because, if I have good quantifiable data, that makes my life 10 times easier,
Sure.
and it allows me to whatever I say to be pretty factual and pretty truthful, so
Good. Well, let's move on to your personal story. Obviously you've gone through a personal transition. Do you mind sharing as much or as little as you feel comfortable with? Kind of want to discuss that and kind of have the viewers learn a little bit more about that.
yeah, absolutely. It it's not been the easiest of tracks, but it's been my journey, and it's been what I needed to go through. Like I mentioned earlier, growing up and this is not a religious podcast by any stretch,
No.
I recorded that one a few days ago.
Yeah.
But it was, growing up the way I grew up, it was very difficult to be able to kind of accept this part about me and
Hmm.
feeling extremely guilty from that standpoint. So therefore, I thought everyone was going to feel that way. Just kind of that worldview that I had really developed for myself. And, it was one of those things I was extremely, extremely scared to to come out as trans.
Right.
And so I remember, like, I made some personal choices, started my transition journey, and didn't tell a single person. I mean, we're talking starting, medication, and didn't tell a soul for about 14 months. And it was funny because I thought I was kind of fooling people because I was growing my hair out, my skin looked incredible, and I get people to come up to me like, "Oh my gosh, your skin's amazing. What are you doing?" I just said, "Oh, just a new routine," or whatever. It was the effects of
Right.
the medication, seeing all these changes. And I was talking to a very good industry friend of mine, and he's like, "Yeah, we knew something was up. We kind of figured that was the case." And
Yeah.
so it's like kind of like a laughable point. But
Right.
I remember the first time I ever told anyone in our industry. I was sitting at this regional trade show, and I told a very good friend of mine at the time. We are both like sitting at the bar as we do in Pro AV,
Right.
and we're just chatting. And I just told her, like, this is what's up. This is my plan. This was November still, and I was like, I'm planning to come out in March of the following year. And so I told her, she told she asked if she could tell a couple people, and just became extremely strong allies.
Hmm.
And were there for me and supportive, and just was an amazing experience. And there was nuances. I always kind of look at it like a baby deer learning to walk, if you will, like trying to find my fitting. How do I do this? How do I be me and be truthful to myself and living my authentic truth, and still do this job? And I found, especially after it being cemented and, just kind of like really understanding myself the last couple of years, I'm able to bring my full self to my job. I don't have those feelings that I felt 5, 6 years ago of just feeling just completely not who I am meant to be. Like
So
it's amazing. Go ahead.
yeah,
Yeah.
I was gonna ask. So the feeling of not being your true self, showed up at work too, right? Because so that lack of confidence kind of followed you into
Yeah.
into the office, and um,
I I had to hide it, but yeah, I was there. I had to, hold it deep down and just try not to let anyone see the pain I was going through. And listen, it doesn't have to be just, coming out as trans. We all deal with things like this.
mhm,
We all
sure,
deal with struggles. We all deal with elements in our lives that wish were different and could change. And it's like, okay, for me, I had to figure out a way to be me,
right,
because I know that it wasn't going to be um, it wasn't gonna look good in the next several years, just where I was heading and things like that. It was a dark time in my life, but, making that choice and then working on myself and then focusing on just being authentic. I don't feel like I felt, like I said, 4 or 5 years ago. I
mhm,
don't have those insecurities or those problems. There's times where I do second guess myself, as we all do,
yeah,
but it's not on every little thing, or that weight we feel on our shoulders, if you will.
sure,
And I feel more like me, and like I'm not afraid to be at a trade show, speaking at a conference, or whatever the case is, because I know by me being myself, and I've gotten feedback from tons of people that told me this,
mhm,
by me being myself, it helps people understand, what being trans is actually like, and then applicable to how they can adjust and be the person that they want to be,
sure,
no matter what that looks like.
yeah. Look, everybody deals with insecurities and
Yeah.
anxieties and stuff like that. It's interesting that you're saying that um, after the transition, you're more confident because you're more, you feel like you're a truer self. Um, but going through the transition, I'm sure there were some anxieties and fear there.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
let's talk about that. Tell me about like how it changed, like through the
Every
process, how you changed, how you changed at work, how you showed
Yeah.
up differently, and then on top of that, like what were some of the reactions,
Yeah.
good or bad?
I was scared almost every turn that I was going to lose my job. And, that was a fear that I had built up in my mind. Um,
Hmm.
just because, you hear different stories, you hear different things. And what I found was the exact exact opposite.
which is great.
I work a lot with Chinese manufacturers. I was extremely worried at what that was going to look like, and honestly, it was one of probably the most amazing experiences. They're like, "We don't care who," and this
Right.
you gotta understand things, They're like, "We don't care who you are. We just want you to be happy and be you."
Right.
And that meant the world to me. And even like traveling to China and like not to be too deep on this, but like my passport and everything still looks very much like the old me. And
Hmm.
so I had like I mentioned to you before, like I have worse issues getting in and out of Chicago than I
Yeah.
do out
It's
of
just
China.
crazy.
So, which
It's
is really
crazy.
funny. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I went to ISC earlier this year, not a second little, glance, whatever. So people who make that a rhetoric and say, "Oh, this is
Hmm.
the worst thing," is like, no, you're fine, you'll be okay. But there is times, like, don't get me wrong, where you do get stopped, and it's that fear of feeling, feeling like, am I going to make my flight? And that's happened to me a few
Sure.
different times in the States. But it's just like, hey, it's just what I got to do. But all in all, through the industry, especially with different, organizations, giving me a voice to be able to speak on this, I'm really grateful for that opportunity, and it's created this awareness. And I never look at it as just, I'm a trans person who does pro AV, but I'm just a person who does pro AV. I
Right.
focus on my job and what I do more than anything else, and everything else is just kind of a secondary. I tell people it's like I want the fact that I'm trans to be probably the most boring thing about me,
Right.
because I have a life to live. I have a
Sure.
career to build, and like that's the most important thing. I'm not going to sit here and rally around, a certain flag or a cause. Like, no, I'm bigger than that. I'm greater than that. My identity is so much more than just how people want to lump me into another group of people. It's, you got to be able to live your life. And I hate groupthink, as if you can tell,
Sure.
through some of these conversations. And I don't like just
Right.
the rhetoric as normal. It's like, no, 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 got to move past that. You got to get out away from that, get away from the noise, if you will, and
Hmm.
truly, understand what you're supposed to do and just do it. Like, keep it simple from that standpoint. Don't believe all the rhetoric that's out there, and just kind of, you know, do what you know is right and move
Sure.
on. So,
You know, through both my day job and this show, I've talked to women and minorities in our industry that's obviously very male, white, middle-aged male dominated industry, right? Um, now that now that you are a woman in this industry, like how's that been different? Have you sensed it? Have you felt it, noticed it at all, or like what? Or do you feel like you're just
yeah,
being you?
it's both. It's I'm just me no matter what. And like I can hang out with the guys, I can hang out with the girls. It doesn't matter from that standpoint. It does feel good when you get that adoption, if you will,
Sure.
from other women in the industry. And feeling close and being in the group chats and things like that, and like having that community, if you will, with them. It means a lot. But I just focus on being me.
Right.
I've heard all the negative things. I've heard the comments, that honestly kind of made me laugh more than anything else. And I was just like, okay, I love that they look at it that way, but whatever. And it's just like, I'm bigger than that. I'm
Good.
moving past that. I've got, like I said earlier, it's like I got things I'm trying to get done and accomplish. I can't allow someone's idiotic mindset to derail
Sure.
me. But
So
it's good when we have community, and I have really close friends that have, adopted me and have made my life great just by, being in their circles and being friends with them, and just honestly, showing up fabulous, if you will, and
right.
like being at the trade show, doing your thing and just being happy. One
Yeah.
of the biggest compliments I get now from people is you actually smile now.
Good.
And like in the past, I just was always feeling all this pain and
Yeah.
pressure that I
I I
and it's not like, "Oh, I gotta
I
smile." It just kinda comes naturally from that
yeah.
point.
No.
So,
I remember pretty
yeah.
intense, pretty intense person. Definitely more fun. Um, and I remember your LinkedIn post, and I'm like, Oh, I wanted to see how, like, people are gonna react, and the outpouring of support was just,
Yeah.
like, so overwhelmingly positive that it was great. Like, it was like a it was a good day, I'm sure, for you, but it was also a good day for,
Yeah.
for me because, like, I got, like, "Oh, our industry is actually is full of good people," you know? It was reassuring, I think,
Yeah.
for a lot of us,
I
you know?
was I was so scared that day. I'm envisioning that day right now, and I created my LinkedIn post the night before. I made some edits the next day, as I always do. I hit send and I just shut my phone off. I'm like, I am not about to. And
Yeah.
so I went and walked around the block a couple times, got some coffee, and I then turned my phone on and it just was blowing up. And I'm like,
Mhm.
oh my gosh, this is amazing.
Yeah, it was great.
And it was a good experience. And, it was something I wasn't really knowing what to expect. But our
Mhm.
industry, in a small way rallied around what I was doing and who I
Yeah.
was, and it felt really nice from that standpoint. And, I value that. I value those conversations and those friendships that developed actually from even that post. One of
Mhm.
my best friends now reached out to me at that time. She's like, "Hey, I've read your story. I'm here for you."
Right.
And, we're best friends, to this day. And like I value that so much.
It's great.
And we should be like that regardless if it shouldn't take a LinkedIn post, if you will, for us to rally around each other. If we see someone that needs assistance or needs help
Yeah,
or is reaching out, by all means, we should be there for each other.
100%. And you know, that's unfortunately a lot of the world, right? Like people look for reasons to tear other people down, and it's awful. But like it's always great when you do see a moment like that when people do rally and like talk about needing being there for each other. Most times, you know, we don't know, right? And they
Right.
don't tell you. So sometimes you just got to be proactive, and the people you care about, reach out to them and be like, "Hey, everything okay? Like, anything you want to talk about?" Let
Yeah.
me ask you, because this is still relatively new for a lot of people and in a lot of communities and so forth. For people who may not have personally experienced it or have it in their lives, they want to be respectful. Maybe they don't fully understand. What should they know?
Yeah. So if you met one trans person, you've met one. So with that being said, each person is an individual. I'm very, I understand our world. Like you mentioned earlier, majority middle-aged cis white male, they're not going to have a clue what to say, pronouns,
Yeah,
etc., blah blah blah. And so I would say, and I field this question a million times. People come up to you like, "Hey, I got a question," and I usually know what that means,
right.
but it's fine. You're not going to know how to frame things correctly, but if you're being respectful, if you're being honest, and then you're taking what they say as advice and applying that, that's the
Mm,
biggest thing you can do.
yeah,
But, I like I mentioned earlier, I want to be measured and judged upon my ability to get the job done and not just someone who is a minority in our industry.
sure.
Um, my biggest focus is on that versus anything else. I've been called from other people in the diversity hire of the year and all this like, guys,
Yeah,
whatever. We got a bigger, job to do than just kind of sitting here and nitpicking each other.
right.
And so I've learned the higher you go and the more you are successful, the more people are going to kind of complain about you. And,
Always. Haters are
let the
haters
hate.
are haters are gonna hate, right?
Yes, I'll be quoting 90s and
Ni
2000s rap lyrics
Yeah,
because I'm
absolutely,
down for
always,
that, Leo.
always,
Yeah,
always, as often as possible. Um,
definitely.
yeah, no, look, it is, something that people just like you said, as long as you're respectful, sometimes,
Yeah.
um, you'll make the
Well, let me
mistake.
say this,
Yeah,
a few years ago, DEI was the hot topic we all were focusing around, and it's
mhm,
important. Now it's definitely not the case, but there's still a need. And don't look at it as a DEI initiative. think of it as your company's culture more than anything else.
Sure.
And how are you creating that place where everyone can give their best self to what you're trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
It's not about being selfish or anything like that, but how are you creating that atmosphere for everyone? Because I know my work is better now than it was a few years ago, just because I don't worry about things that I worried about in the past.
Hmm.
I'm able to just be myself, focus on what I need to get done and do it. So
Right.
create that strong company culture from that standpoint. And
Yeah.
don't be worried about what you have to call it or how it has to like fit into an HR slot or whatever. Like focus on building the culture that you can be successful with other people and like they can feel like, hey, this is a great place to work. This is where I want to be successful and where I want to grow as a person. And if
Right.
you do, your talent pool or your employees are going to look broader and more diverse, and you're going to be able to do the work that you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
It's that plain, that simple. And that's why we need programs, like I mentioned earlier, about DEI, because
Mhm.
it allows us to kind of look at different elements like, oh, if we go back to that same pond and go fish, that's the only type of fish we're going to catch. But if we're
Right.
trying to build an ocean or an aquarium, we want variety. We want to be able to create an ecosystem and a structure that all can thrive in.
Yeah.
And then that's when I honestly that's where I want to work. That's where I want to be at.
Look,
Um,
I think it's funny because like sometimes people think like, oh, DEI or diversity hires may maybe not be the most qualified, but you're just filling up quotas or whatever. Um, it's more than that. It's about establishing that, like you mentioned, that best culture where not
yeah.
just are you more diverse, but the top performers want to be there as well because the culture is that good. So there's a lot more than just you know um, I, it sometimes it just gets a little too simplistic. But let me ask last question, then we'll move on. But like, what would you how would you recommend somebody if they make a mistake, or like, do they just blow past it and just, or do they stop, apologize, like if somebody misgenders or whatever, like what's your recommendation on how to handle that?
Yeah, that's a two-way answer, honestly. If you're unsure of someone how they identify their pronouns, maybe stay away from pronouns.
Hmm.
Maybe ask them, just like, hey, I want to make sure I'm treating you with respect. May I ask you what pronouns you prefer?
Hmm.
And then be able to engage that way. But if you
Sure.
make a mistake and you just kind of like blow past all the signs, like, you know, um, apologize. It's not that hard. And, there's times I remember early on, like in my transition, where I would definitely get misgendered and
Hmm.
still to this, it'd be like, oh, and I don't want to correct anyone out of just malice or like an attitude or anything like that. I always want to be kind and, I want to be able to help with from an understanding, but also not for an over explanation. Like they don't need 19 different, stories behind why you do, why you identify like this. Just like, hey, just so you know, I use these pronouns and this is how I
Yeah.
would appreciate if you would, and just drop it. If you have
Right.
confidence from that standpoint and just drop it, it's fine, and that's the easiest way to handle it. Don't make a big deal out of it. Like honestly,
No,
on both
well, what
sides.
yeah, yeah, on both sides. Okay, so recommendation is just to be like, oh, wait, sorry, and then keep going, right? I'm
Yeah.
like, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I'm sorry, because you could tell, like, the look in someone's face, changes. Like, if
Hmm.
they're working on their identity, they're trying to figure things out, and they get misgendered, you're going to see their body react some. It does
Sure.
hurt, I'm not gonna
Yeah.
lie. But at the same time, you pivot in the conversation. If it's the trans person or the person who doesn't identify for those programs, just kind of stopping the conversation. It's like, hey, if it's possible, please use these, or just, not making it a deal, address it later. It just depends on the situation. There's no one true way to be able to handle that,
Sure.
but it takes kindness and understanding on both parts for there to be the desired outcome of just understanding more than anything else. And that's the biggest goal.
Yeah,
So that's how
kindness.
I look at it.
Kindness.
Yeah.
That's hard. That's
You know,
hard
it's
these
funny,
days.
this whole conversation has been like, what did we do in kindergarten? You know, we told
Right.
tell the truth, we're kind to people, and it's funny how we're still learning that from a business standpoint to this day.
Yeah.
So,
Right. You know, we talked about, it's the basics, going back to the basics. You know,
yeah.
be a good person. Just be kind, right? Listen more than you talk. So learn. But all right, let's start wrapping up. You know, uh obviously you've had a storied, successful career. If you were going to talk to anyone who's just breaking into this industry, or somebody who feels maybe a little stuck, you know, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, first off, they're more than welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to engage with them and just talking through things. But, you know, it's about building a plan for yourself. You know, where are you wanting to go? What are you looking to accomplish? What does that look like? And then just work on that. And like, you know, I remember being feeling stuck a few years back and just like, okay, what is it that I really want to do? And then sit there, devise that plan and then just go for it. Change doesn't happen overnight. So you got to
Yeah.
understand, like, you may feel frustrated right now. You're probably still going to feel frustrated for a little bit more. Um, Give yourself space. You know, like I mentioned earlier, it was extremely important to me. Mentorship, talk to individuals that where you want to go, build friends outside of your own little community and area, go to different events, you know, go to different trade shows, you know, get to know people. You know, that's why I love, you know, I love working through the channel because they're also engaged with dealers regionally. And so it's different environments and different atmospheres, you know, all across the United States. Get
Yeah.
involved and Avixa does a great job of creating groups and things like that that you can join.
Hmm.
And you know, there's a lot of resources that can help you from that standpoint. You know, but
Oh, sure.
if you do feel stuck, you know, that's on you. You
Right.
know, that's on you to change either,
Yeah.
you know, where you're at, you know, from a career standpoint, or to, you know, ask your boss, like, hey, what do I need to do to be able to achieve the next step in this organization? You know, have those conversations, but make sure though you're at a point to where you can be able to receive that feedback that you need to correctly. Because there's
Sure.
no good of going out and soliciting feedback from individuals if you're just going to say in your mind, well, they're wrong. This is a
Right.
problem. I can't believe it's like that does
Yeah.
no one any good. That's a
Mm,
wasted time on everyone's part and not about to do that. You know,
yeah.
be able to be, you know, to receive that constructive feedback, you know, with the right spirit, right attitude, and then take advice and go. You know,
All right.
don't stay. You know, I will say, I was able to use that feeling stuck mindset, you know, just that whole thing as fuel and motivation to continue to grow and develop my career.
Sure.
And that was the biggest thing. I use it as just that momentum. You know, like athletes will, you know, put up a picture of the team they're playing against, or whatever the case is, for fuel and motivation that they want to win. Like I would sit there mentally, like, okay, I want to get here, and I would envision myself when I got to that spot in my career,
Yeah.
and you know, it helped me to kind of understand next steps and things like that, and just creating that process. Like, okay, that's step, you know, K, I'm on step C. What do I need to do? And build a
Yeah.
game plan, talk to people, and don't be afraid to reach out. Like that's gotta happen. You can't just stay, like I said earlier, in your little box and expect to grow. You know,
Yeah. Well,
it's like,
people think that if I just show up to work and work hard, I'll naturally promote and people will pull me up, and like, no, like it
you know,
just doesn't happen.
working
Like
hard,
yeah, you got to go out there and
that's
go
That's
get
the
it.
bare minimum in my mind. Working
Yeah.
hard, doing good work, it's like, what else are you going to add to this organization for us to be big picture
Well, it's
focused and
even
grow?
but it's even more than that. Like you have to be your own career
Yeah,
planner. You have to be your own career architect, where you have to go and push to get
right.
into, right? Because nobody's going to come
I
grab you and pull you up.
exactly.
You have to go and want it and demand it and get it, right? You just
Yeah,
can't sit there and wait for somebody to come tap you on the shoulder and be like, okay, it's time to move you up into the
yeah.
corner office. It's just
I
not
look at
happening.
it like this, no
Yeah.
one's coming to save you. you better
No,
save yourself. You know,
correct.
I love that adage, and I fly a lot, and I love being in an airplane. It's like one of my favorite things in the world. And they always say, you know, put your own face mask on before assisting
Yeah,
other individuals. And a lot of times we forget because we're so busy running around trying to do everything else. Like it
yeah,
doesn't work that way. Take care of your own business first, and you
100%,
know, got to
100%.
do it that way. Yeah.
All right. Well, look, Jessica, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your career and sharing your personal story. I think it's been very enlightening, and hopefully the listeners gained a lot from it, and will continue to follow your career and gain a lot from your insights and wisdoms. To listeners, if you're still here, thank you so much for sticking with us. And hit that like, subscribe, 5-star review buttons. Always appreciated. And until next week, good luck on your hunts.